morning's Technology is Cold, People Are Warm panel. I am Maryelizabeth Yturralde with Mysterious Galaxy and Creating Conversations here in Southern California. So we're going to be talking about technology and future casting and the importance of interactions between people and machinery and where those lines get fuzzy and where they get warm and fuzzy. And I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I'll have some questions for them, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. WonderCon special guest, Cory Doctorow. SB Divya. And J. Dianne Dotson. Dianne dreamed up other worlds and their characters as a child in the 1980s in East Tennessee. I feel like there's a editorial comment to insert there about, well, yeah, because East Tennessee.
They make sure that you know the difference.
Dianne formed her own neighborhood astronomy club before age 10 to educate her friends about the universe. In addition to writing stories, she drew and painted her characters, gave them outrageous space fashions. Space fashion will be a topic later, and created travel guides and glossaries for the world she invented. As an adult, Dianne earned her Bachelor of Science and spent several years working in research. She published Heliopause, the Questrison Saga, Book 1 in 2018, and its sequel arrives this May. She's also a science writer and watercolorist and lives with her husband and children in Southern California. They make up a home of makers and nerds who enjoy Dianne's baked goods, including brownies, which she brings to her events, so you should come to the event for the next book.
True. There's always brownies, and no, they're not special brownies. They're special because I made them, so you have to come and have them.
Welcome, Dianne. And Maura Milan. So in pre-panel conversation, we were talking about what sorts of things will we be discussing, and you know, it's a very rich and fertile sort of topic, and there's a lot of approaches, but one that seems particularly timely is let's talk about making space for everybody by maybe, I don't know, making spacesuits for everybody. So let's talk about some of the ways in which, you know, we hope to get to some of the futures that you all have written about, in which technology is accessible to people, or maybe not, and maybe that's part of the conflict in the drama. So, Maura, do you want to start? Because you immediately come to mind when we think of this topic.
Yeah, so for me, like, there's a whole bunch of tech that people can actually modulate into the suit, as well as a lot of body modifications, and that comes into play. And there's like a lot of like black market things going on, where instead of like using stuff like Google Glass, like kind of like a future version of Google Glass, where things will just be like grafted right onto your eyeball, and you could just see like measurements and infrared and that type of thing. I think for fashion and everything like that, I usually tend to make everything black, and it's because I also wear a lot of black. Whenever there's like any color, it's kind of surprising. I think in my next book, I actually have a little bit of red, which is like a big deal for me.
Dianne?
So, of course, I started doing space fashion as a young kid, so I took it to the extreme of how fabulous can you make it and it still be practical? You know, so let's make it. You got to think it was in the 80s, so you can imagine the day glow, but you can imagine two phosphorescent outfits, which actually, that's a little bit of a book 2 spoiler, but there will be a phosphorescent space outfit in book 2. So I come from that background of wanting style and function, and I feel strongly, however, that we need to think about accessibility first and foremost in everything related to our space outfits. And I want to think that space should not be for dilettantes, it should be for denizens. We want to make a future in space and not have it be for just a few. Everyone with every ability should be able to go to space. and everyone of every identity, every belief. You know, we all should be there. That should be our future. We should dress in a way that reflects our backgrounds if we wanted to, with our space outfits, our cultural heritage. I think that's important. And I do think that we should, in 2019, be able to have spacesuits that fit everyone on the International Space Station.
What, not just two?
Exactly.
Divya?
So I think I come at this from an economic stratification angle in addition to purely a matter of representation, which I absolutely applaud. And that is, money talks, and there's too many situations where the excuse is given of it's too expensive to accommodate all the diverse needs that we need to. And that's a big part of what happened in reality. That's what happened a few years ago with Ubisoft and Assassin's Creed. And this wasn't even a physical multi-million-dollar spacesuit. It was just a woman's body in a video game. But it was too costly to render. And you know, we see it reflected across all of society, and the way I usually come at it in my fiction is protagonists who come from economically underprivileged backgrounds having to make use of the technology that's available to them in order to then innovate and produce and adapt the technology for their needs.
When we see a spacesuit not supplied on the space station, that's the visible portion of a systemic problem, right? That sinks really deep and starts with things like engineering pipelines, who's in the room, and so on. And while we have as storytellers, we like to lionize the individuals who blaze trails. One of the most caustic things we've done over the last 40 years is describe all of our problems in terms of individual actions and responsibilities, right? Like climate change is a problem of your individual recycling choices, right? And not these overarching things. And ultimately, these are movements that make differences and not individuals who blaze trail. The best thing you can hope for an individual who blazes trail is that they'll inspire a movement that will make the deep systemic changes.
So one of the aspects that I wanted to touch on in this conversation was some of the emotional content of interacting with technology, whether it's integrated technology or outside technology. You know, whether you're apologizing to Siri when you accidentally bring her up on your phone unintending to, or whether you're designing something for both functionality and aesthetic reasons. So what are ways in which you have tried to make sure that you're incorporating that emotional component that human users have with technology in your stories?
Well, in my book, I have several. There's AI called monitors, and they basically they run the room. So there'll be like a holographic image within this room, kind of just talking to you and making sure that everything is okay. So it is kind of like a futuristic Siri, like, hey, do you want music? And then you can just suggest music and it'll play it. But there is kind of like this interesting give and take with them. It's like you can't just order them around. There is kind of like a negotiation with them in a way. So they could kind of like deny like anything you say, or they could, or there's ways to kind of get around some of the things that they'll say that they don't want to do. So you kind of have to like trick them in some strange way and trick their programming.
On Mandela Research Station in Heliopause, you have a selection of bots, drones, AI, holograms in your room if you want your room to look like Oregon, which main character Forrester constantly does. He misses Oregon. And I make it so that there's an interesting interaction between people and bots, or people and AI and people and drones. It's a distinct difference. In terms of AI, there's a character in Heliopause named Gibbons, and he has a very interesting relationship with his AI, which he has taken and changed, and to avoid any spoilers, he's made it so that it resembles someone who he loved and lost. And this AI kind of creates a little bit of a problem on the station. And he actually has to deal, it's a little bit of an ethical problem for him too. It's discouraged on the station, since it's a research station, that you would use an AI as sort of a pleasure situation. But Gibbons has his glass of scotch and he rolls with it. But meanwhile, you have little bots that Forster uses to send out and record things, and they'll wake him up and kind of nudge him when he's kind of drifting off. But also even the station itself, to help people feel more at home that far out in the solar system. It's a soft, welcoming environment in which you have conservatories, but you also have a soft floor, which kind of freaks Forster out. But the point of the soft floor is not only because people are walking on it all the time, but also because it's actually generating power for the station as you walk. The resistance in the floor creates that. So there's all these different aspects to Mandira that make it an interesting life in which we're very much entangled with technology, but there's also a very human element and connection. And also there's the robot medic, and he can transform into a wheelchair or whatever you want him to.
I find that for Escape Pod, the majority of our short story submissions that deal with time travel are love stories. And that is a common trope for also time loops, right? Time travel loops. You're often either going back to save a relationship or make someone fall in love with you. And this is, I think, a classic example of the technology is super cool and there's a million awesome things you can do with time travel. But why do we keep coming back to time travel love stories? And that's because as human beings, we always wonder about what could we have done differently and how do we save the person that we love, or how do we get that person to love us that much more?
One other emotion that we all like to experience is security. And part of, I think, the trouble with being either a consumer of or a creator of science fiction is sometimes a burden of knowledge. Having enough knowledge to have concerns about our current security. So do you want to touch a little bit on how you feel knowing things like, hey, so there's really cool apps for medical stuff now, and there's also hackers who can break into that software and suddenly change, medical records in hospitals and dosages and stuff, or, let's face it, social media security, etc. So how does that, how does your knowledge impact you personally, and does it flow into your work?
I think I come from, since I worked in clinical research for some time, I come from a place of wanting patient data being secure, not just because of HIPAA, but just because it's morally the right thing. And so that does inform a little bit of my work, both in books 1 and book 2, and how characters come into a situation, a medical situation in which someone says, well, why don't I call the medic bot? Medic bot comes and does its thing, but then this other character is also working with the suffering migraine person Forster and manipulating him a little bit with his own device that he puts on his arm, and it actually records what Forster does. And Ephraim is saying to him, oh, this is going to help you, we can keep track of things. But then you lose a little bit of, the morality there. You start to think, well, he's tracing everything. This guy can record my heartbeat. He can listen in on my conversations. Whereas on the station itself, I have entire rooms that they're not going to record you on Mandira unless you command them to. Like, room, start recording, and it'll record everything in the room. And then you have the AI, Veronica, who is just this gamut of problems of it can access anything on that station, and it can manipulate the person who's running it. So there's a little bit of everything going on, but it all comes back to, what's right for us, as people, and in taking care of other people in wellness and in sickness, in terms of technology. That's kind of where I'm coming from with my work.
And this is something that freaks me out a lot, actually. Every time I will download an app, I feel like I always have to sign up for something. I feel like I always just have to give up my email, my age, my gender, everything. So everyone has my stuff out there, and then as the days and years are going by, we're becoming so all right with just surrendering this type of information, where we're almost kind of immune to it. And we have to kind of just ask the question of we are giving this information up, but up to what point, you know? I think there's still a sense of yourself that is maintained. Like, I feel like there's a lot of like your own emotions that you can't be able to upload there for everyone to see.
So, how do you feel about the fact that science fiction, because of the cyberpunk culture, has sort of embraced underground, anti-establishment attitudes? How does that intersect with where we seem to be going? I don't know how many of you saw that Mark Zuckerberg wrote an op-ed inviting the government to help regulate social media. And so that seems completely at odds with, science fiction, cyberpunk, technoculture, where we're just like down with the man and we're gonna do it all ourselves. Do you think science fiction needs to change the narrative to embrace, reality and the public consciousness of we have to bring government into our side versus alienating them?
I think that not all regulation is created equal, right? I think when Zuck says, make me some rules, what he's really saying is, oh, please don't throw me in that briar patch, right? It's like, make me some rules that Facebook alone can afford to comply with and none of my competitors can comply with. And let me adhere to them, and let me and my lobbyists in the room when those rules are being formulated so that we can be sure that those rules don't gore our ox. And then let me use those rules as an absolute defense against liability, and to say, well, I adhere to the rules, any negative consequences are the result of inadequacy in the rules and not my own bad actions.
I would add, and I was going back to the AI in my story, Veronica, and how Gibbons is so attached to someone he lost, and he's coping with his AI to the point that he has her basically 3D print, a model of the person he lost, the ethics there. And the only thing I don't have a problem with someone doing that as a manner of coping with grief per se, because it's not my right to tell someone that. But at the same time, I fear that sort of thing will be taken advantage of by someone like a hacker that could take advantage of whatever you've made for yourself to get over your loss using AI and run with it. And in this case, something does happen with that AI that nobody anticipated. And so, I'm hopeful that in our future that we have multiple ways of dealing with emotional situations, whether it be grief or ecstasy, and in this case, Veronica represents both for this person. And so I think that as long as we can keep them secure, and have someone not manipulate those things that we create to get over the darkness of the night, and I think AI is generally a good thing, and we just have to answer all the questions we can come up with related to it.
I think maybe since the golem, our conception of maid servants has been a vessel for our anxieties and our aspirations, and also our secret shame about how we treat people. I think that like in Annalee Newitz's book Autonomous, or VN by Madeline Ashby, or even The Clockwork Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi, you see an extension of the animal rights advocate, that the violence that we visit on other sentient creatures lowers our own moral capacity for empathy, and creates a space in which it is sometimes moral to abuse people or things that might think and feel pain. And when I look at Hal and look at people kind of worried about AI today, I often see a reflection of an obvious anxiety. You look at Elon Musk, who claims that AI is going to take over the world and enslave us. And Musk, he's a technologist of some repute, right? I know a bit about technology as well. I don't recognize his concerns. I don't think that we're at risk of that, but I also look at Musk's behavior, right? Where he's like abusing Xanax and saying things on Twitter where he picks stupid fights. He's clearly miserable. He's miserable about his company. He's kind of a prisoner of it. And I'm like, oh, he's not worried about AI. He's worried about a different artificial life form, limited liability companies, right? Which are like transhuman limited, artificial colony organisms that use us as gut flora, and who have legal personhood, right? This is like, I think that you can see this anxiety reflected in him. For me, I think the way to square the circle or have a hopeful kind of outcome is something like Lee Phillips' new nonfiction book, The People's Republic of Walmart, where he says, well, what if we were just to take all of the exploitative labor relationships in something like Amazon, which is otherwise very handy to have around, and we replace them with robots. And rather than having anxiety about having the robots take our jobs, we celebrate the fact that we will unchain thousands of children from factory machines in this Pearl River Delta in South China, and we'll free up all those people doing stoop labor in factories and warehouses, and we'll just have robots under some form of democratic control, you know, making sure that we get our USB cables when we need them. And that to me is a very exciting idea. It's one where you don't need AIs, and you deliberately stay away from the idea of creating cognitive thinking beings. It's, you know, Douglas Adams nailed this, right? Like, what is it like to give a door genuine personality? Well, it's pretty depressing.
And I also would observe just sort of generally, when we're talking about fictional scenarios, there aren't as many utopians written as dystopians, in part because to have a story you have to have conflict, and it's often more difficult to generate a conflict when you have your AI who knows how to brew that perfect cup of tea.
Can I object slightly? Oh, sorry, you go ahead.
Oh, or coffee.
I think that it's not dystopian to imagine that systems will break down. I said this before. Engineers who design systems on the assumption that they won't break down are not utopians, they're idiots, right? That's the guy who didn't put lifeboats on the Titanic because it was unsinkable, right? It is dystopian to think that when they break down, we can't get them started again, right? That we fluked into a functional system that we'll never fluke into again, that are, you know, we're lapsed from the noble people we were when America was great, and now that we are degenerated, if the system broke down, we couldn't make it. Right? So exactly, right? That's what that Lapsarian narrative is. Whereas to assume that, like, if the machine stops, it might coast to a gentle stop and we can push it and get it started again. That's utopian. It has lots of room for conflict.
Yes, in the gray shirt.
Do you guys have thoughts on like inside out versus outside in world building? And whether it's harder to get a good human-centered story with outside in. You want me to elaborate on?
What about inside out versus outside in world building, I think is the question.
Yeah, like the idea of outside in is like you build the world first. So you think of like the physics, the geology, and then the biology, and then like the cultures, and then the level of the individual. So you don't start with your characters.
I think we
start
can
with
run
the
from
world.
that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, do you have like what are your different like approaches to that? And
Dianne, you want to start? I don't think you've been first yet.
I'll go back to the coffee. So, and on Mandira Research Station, it's really far out in the solar system, and while there's a conservatory, there's no coffee plants. So, this one guy who's like your total lounge lizard, Troy, he's obsessed with making the perfect cup of coffee out of absolute garbage, you know, really old stuff, and doesn't have fresh beans. And that's like his whole shtick. Is like, try my coffee. Forster's like, oh my God, no, it's terrible. It tastes like ash. So part of the subplot of Mandira and Heliopause itself, the story, is that Troy just wants a good cup of coffee at the edge of the solar system. Can't he just have it? You know, and it's just part of how he gets through life. And so I kind of come from, and then Meredith makes quilts out of leftover fabric scraps she finds around the station. And these people are trying to make a world similar to what they had before they arrived there, or maybe they've been there most of their career. In some of their cases, the younger people are just starting out. But they're just trying to make home in the cold and the dark, you know, make quilts, embroider things, make coffee, dream about Oregon. And so I try to build from the characters out and how they feel and what they love, who they love, where they love, I miss hiking, you know, things like this. And when they go to that conservatory and it changes to dusk and everybody's kind of hanging out under fruit trees and having a good time, they can at least stop for a minute and think, you know, we've got each other here, we've got a family, we've got food, Meredith's gonna make me some pie later, we're gonna have some tea. You know, and so I kind of build from those emotional, simple connections that we have every day that you might miss if you were flung in an extraordinary situation, and I build from there.
And this is probably the last comment just because of time, so.
Yeah, I'll just beat that. I will agree with everyone that I think you can go either way, speak speaking. For myself, I've had stories that are born of characters and then coming up with the world they inhabit in order to explore their conflict. And I've also had ideas. I think a lot of science fiction principles are you come up with the idea first, and then, like Cory says, you kind of think about who are the people that those ideas will create conflict for in their lives. And so most people tend to go outside in that case, right? So you build the world, maybe not down to the physics and the geology of it, but at least you start with your what if. What if time travel is possible? What if, you can build a sentient arm? Then what happens? And then you come up with the characters for whom that might have most impact, and that drives the actual story. But I think it's just as possible, like Maura said, to go the other way. You can come up with a character.
Ideally there's a feedback loop between the two.
Yeah, that's kind of
Or
the
the
revision
Kotsu
process,
machine.
right? And that's where I tend to find myself. Like, most of my stories end up one or the other, and then when I revise it, I figure out which piece is missing of the two. It's often I have all the world and I don't have the heart, or I have all the heart and not enough of the world and the conflict. And so you can kind of come back and layer that in.
And then you have cold technology and warm people. That was
Nicely done.
beautiful. Good job.
Nicely done.
All right, thank you all so much for joining us. If you have further questions for our authors, or if you're interested in learning more about their works, they will be going down to the exhibitor hall in the author signing area, which is at the end of aisle 100 in room A. So once again, thank you and have a great WonderCon.